Hey, how's it going? Okay, Brittany, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, sorry about the inconvenience this morning.
Is this
Uh,
Jason or Mark? Oh my
this
God.
this is Jason.
Hi, Jason.
We greatly appreciate you doing this for us today.
My pleasure.
And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now, and I'm gonna go ahead and mute the mic here so we don't have any interruptions.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning, Illinois. Thank you for having me today. My name is Brittany Neff. I work as a PFAS specialist on the PFAS team here. But first of all, I just want to say thank you all because, it's so exciting for me to be here in front of wastewater professionals. I truly enjoy talking to people like you, which is why I love my job here at PACE. Your work is often very unnoticed, and you guys have such a great impact, helping remove these harmful contaminants and making sure our water is safely returned to the ecosystems is so important for the health and safety and our well-being. So just want to throw that out there and say thank you guys very, very much. You guys are so underappreciated. Just a little bit about me. My career started in pharmaceuticals. I worked as a bench chemist for about 12 years. Um, from there, I made the leap into environmental probably about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, where I started working with PFAS and fell in love with these compounds and how difficult they were to quantitate. And it was all very new, kind of like the microplastics thing is going on now. It's all very new to us when we first started looking into these compounds, and fell in love with it. Started my journey with PACE about a year and a half ago, and I am so lucky to be able to talk to people like you guys and just help educate on what PFAS are and how we can help you meet those regulatory guidelines that are so confusing sometimes. So thank you all, and I hope you learned something. I know webinars can be a little droning. I hope this one isn't, and we can figure this out together as we learn how to navigate. Just a little brag on PACE here. This map shows the PACE labs located across the country and what they specialize in. Um, we are the largest American-owned laboratory network. These blue dots are the labs that I work out of. They represent our PFAS labs, testing anywhere from drinking water, wastewater, soil, biota, and industrial products. The ones with those red circles around them, those are our drinking water laboratories and the labs that participated in UCMR5. We're going to talk a lot about UCMR5 in this webinar. Mainly Lindsay's going to focus on that, but that is the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, and it's the 5th round of that. And in that study, they looked at 29 PFAS as well as lithium. Okay, so these labs participated and were certified for that UCMR5 method, and it looked at 10,000 public water systems and helped them meet those requirements. PACE has a nationwide network of accredited labs certified under programs like NELAC, ISO, DoD, and DOE. And of course, we are certified in those PFAS state specific. We're certified in those types of things as well. So, if your state requires certification, we have a lab that can do that for you. We like to refer to PFAS as a puzzle, or mainly here at PACE, we call it the Wild West show. That's because, as you know, PFAS is a very rapidly evolving space. There's a lot of moving parts. And while we're seeing encouraging progress, there's still a lot of questions, which makes my job very interesting and why I love it. We're making solid headway on the first 2 bullets here. We are started seeing some federal regulations when the EPA set those legally enforceable MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels, for 6 compounds, and that created a baseline for all the states. The EPA finalized Method 1633 for detecting 40 PFAS in environmental media, such as wastewater, and states have adopted those methods, and they're now showing up in NPDES permits. UCMR5 also required sampling of those large PO2Ws. One thing about the state by state variability. Again, Wild West show, because it's like I call it a patchwork quilt across the nation. Each state's kind of doing their own thing. They're kind of doing their own studies, looking at different types of issues that that particular state is having. Another problem is the lack of environmental test methods. There's really not that many. Of course, we saw the drinking water methods that we're going to talk about later, but the 1633 is really the only one that the EPA has accredited that has any backing. There's thousands of PFAS compounds, guys. There are 14 to 15,000 compounds that we know about. Okay, how are we going to look at all those, and what's going to be regulated next? Ultra low detection limits in those complex matrices. A lot of times, we're looking at part per trillion levels in our drinking water, and that's the only standard that we have to look at. When we apply those types of standards to matrices like wastewater, biosolids, AFFF concentrate, things like that, that's very, very tough. And then our restrictive field sampling guidance. I know you guys have heard about the field sampling guidance, how you really can't wear anything, that everything you have has PFAS in it, and it's so ubiquitous. So we're going to talk about all these things, and hopefully we can work on this together and figure out a plan of action. Here's our agenda for today, guys. We're going to start with my favorite topic, PFAS chemistry and its definition. Now, I know you guys know what PFAS are. If you've been in the water industry, I mean, you've heard about PFAS. So I really hate to be the one to kind of talk about it too much or, tell you what you already know, but it's important, right? And some people might not exactly understand. So PFAS are a large, diverse group of manufactured compounds, and they've been used for decades for many industrial applications and consumer products. When we talk about PFAS contamination, we're often dealing with what we call our heavy hitter industries, those with a long history of PFAS use or discharge. As you can see here, there are 9 tiles. These are the heavy hitters. If these industries are discharging into your system, you will have PFAS issues, and you need to kind of figure out how we're going to go about this and make sure these industries are monitoring, okay? So PFAS are incredible, guys, like talking incredible. I can't imagine our lives without them, to be quite honest. I mean, they are oil, water, grease, and heat resistant. That is lovely when it's talking about industry, right? These are great qualities. Mist and fume suppressants. We'll talk more about AFFF and how it's really amazing when it comes to suppressing those fuel fires, things like that. Surfactants, lubricants, all of the stuff that it can accidentally contaminate your samples somehow, if there's something in the system of a mechanism of an instrument or machine that you're using in industry, all of these things. So the thing about them is they're entirely man-made. None of these occurred naturally. They're bioaccumulative, which means they are building up in our tissues, in our animals' tissues, in our fish tissue, things like that. Hydrophilic, this is the problem, right? Hydrophilic means they love the water. And they have documented health impacts, which is why it's so important that we're looking at these and figuring out what we can do. So I didn't tell you this, Scott, but I am in North Carolina, and I live right next to the Camp Lejeune base. I'm actually married to a Marine, and we are constantly dealing with bad water. So as you know, there's been a lot of historical use of AFFF, just from, firefighting, training activities, airports, things like that. We've had to do, those are big impacts that we're dealing with here in my state. Also, we have a very dense concentration of textile manufacturers. I'm not super familiar with what's happening in Illinois, but I do know that like textile manufacturers, carpet, mohawk, things like that. These are big problems because they're using Scotch guard type things on these textiles, and it's coming into our industrial discharge and the fabric treatments, things like that. It's ending up in our water systems. So So let's talk about the classes of PFAS. So it's very misunderstood. PFAS are not just one compound. It's a whole class of compounds. And the name says a lot. Per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. Whew, it's a lot. Per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. So usually what we're dealing with is we're dealing with like a carboxylic acid or a sulfonic acid. In this case, we're going to talk about let me get my pointer here, a carboxylic acid. Okay, so the alkyl part of the compound is this chain of fluorine carbon bonds. We call this the tail of the molecule. And at the head, this is your carboxylic acid group, okay? Every single carbon, and that's these little places here, is fluorinated. Y'all, this is the strongest bond in organic chemistry. When they made this, they knew what they were doing. It is strong. It's good in industry. It's not going to be degraded by heat, by any oxygen. You know, it's not going to be changed by anything unless we really are working at it and doing something crazy. It's going to last. It's persistent. It's forever. Okay. Strongest bond in nature. They're very difficult to treat. Okay. Over here on the other side of the classes of compounds, we have the polyfluoroalkyls. Now, as you can see, it's not as complex and like lattice-like as this one over here, because there's a couple weak links going on. Here we have the head of the molecule, but we still have a carbon-carbon hydrogen bond going on right here. So it's not as strong as its back end of the tail. And what happens is when we apply heat or an oxidative chemical, say we're treating it in our wastewater system, what happens is this is going to break apart. But we're left with this fluorinated tail that's going to eventually turn into a terminal PFAS. Okay, and these are so important. These are our precursors. And you guys are going to hear that term so often. I know you probably already have, but they're precursors. This is like the little crystal ball into your future. When we find out that you have, you know, those precursors will turn into those terminal PFAS, your influence is going to look a lot different than your effluent. Okay, that's because things are changing in there sometimes, and it might not make any sense, but it will once we figure out what degraded to make this happen at the end of your effluent. You know, what's happening in your systems. Okay. Okay, so I know you guys have heard about the two most widely studied compounds, and that's PFOA and PFOS. We already talked a lot about that bonding, the CF bonding, but what's important about these two is that they are no longer allowed to be made in the US anymore. That doesn't mean that other countries are not still making them, guys, but we are no longer allowed. That's because they are likely carcinogens, and they've been linked to things like low birth weight, increasing liver enzymes, and hormone disruptors. So PFOA, that's the one that's used in our nonstick cookware or Teflon. It's also used in like wiring, insulators, food packaging, and the list goes on. And it was created by DuPont. Has anyone, I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have seen the documentary, it's called The Devil We Know, or watched the movie Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo. But it's all about what happened in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Okay, this is where it all came to light. And it started or ignited the largest toxicological study that has ever been done. Okay, so what was happening in Parkersburg is that they were making PFOA for the use of Teflon, and they were discharging it into the water. And women in the lab started noticing that they started having birth defects in their children. And it became a question, like, why is this happening to just the women in the lab? And then, you know, where it was discharging to, a man owned a farm, and he had a lot of deaths of his cows, and their teeth were turning black, and things were just going kind of awry ever since DuPont started making this chemical. So it raised the questions, okay? So because of that large toxicological study, they looked at 70,000 exposed people. And what they found was links between PFOA exposure, high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, hypertension in expectant mothers. These compounds persist in our blood for many, many years. Again, they're called forever chemicals. I don't love that, but that's what they're called. That's what they're calling them these days. But 99% of Americans have them in their blood. So they refer to PFOA in those films as C8, and that is because there's 8 carbons in these molecules, okay? On the other side, there's PFAS. This is the other highly studied one. This is our Scotchgard, guys. This was created by 3M. This is our waterproofing. So in the 1940s, the DoD was using this as a tank sealant during World War II. Again, it's also used in that AFFF firefighting foam. PFAS is the main ingredient. It's in the part per million levels. When we're spraying that onto our fields and things, for training activity, it's at part per million level, and we're trying to get everything down to part per trillion levels, so less dangerous levels that we know of. Okay, so like I said, I live next to a military base, and a lot of times they're doing constructions and they're elongating runways or things like that. And they have to test football field sizes of soil and determine, like, are these contaminated? And sometimes we have to turn that data around really, really fast because they need to know if it needs to go to a hazardous landfill or if it can be landfilled in a normal landfill. Sometimes they try to wash it, but still you're dealing with the rinsate and things like that. So a lot of issues with these compounds, they just don't go away. But the good news is that we're learning how to treat them, okay? So as concerns around those legacy PFAS, like PFOA and PFAS grew, companies began to develop what they hoped would be safer alternatives. So these are known as the short chain PFAS, typically containing anywhere from 4 to 6 carbon chains. And there's definitely shorter ones as well, but it's a little different than those 8 carbon chains that we saw in PFOA and PFAS. The idea was that these shorter chains would be more water soluble and less bioaccumulative, which is true to a certain extent, but they come with their own set of challenges. One major problem is mobility. So, I always make the analogy that it's kind of like a Big Mac in traffic. So you have a Big Mac truck, and that's your PFOA and PFASs and longer chains. But then you have Priuses that can break through traffic and kind of scoot around and move through a little quicker. They're just more mobile. They're smaller. They can get around better, which means they're creating their whole new issue in the environment because they are able to move and find themselves in places they shouldn't be, moving through ground or soil into the groundwater a little easier. So especially, as a lab rat, they're very tricky in the lab. These short chain PFAS can scoot through our extraction cartridges that we use to analyze, and we're going to talk a little more about how we're able to help with that so that we're able to quantitate them and have accurate data. But it does create a whole new issue. They're very hard to remediate, harder to contain. So although they do the trick and it made sense at one point, we're still seeing that they have toxicological concerns, especially with like PFAS, which is a really, it's a replacement for PFAS. They're still seeing toxicological concerns. And this one is used in agriculture a lot of times. So, that's an interesting topic, is that it's used in the agriculture. So what's it really doing? Just we need to know, we need to learn about it, right? Okay, so in my area here, this is a big deal. And the reason I'm mentioning it for you guys is because it did end up in the maximum contaminant levels. But this is actually made in my backyard, or it's made in Wilmington. I don't live in Wilmington, but it's about an hour away. PFOA cannot be manufactured, like we said. So DuPont started manufacturing Gen X in 2007. It's actually a subsidiary of DuPont known as Chemours. Its presence was first brought to light when a research study was conducted on our Cape Fear River, and they found this strange chemical in the water source. It was showing up in headlines all around, all over the place. And Gen X was the name of the study they were doing, or it was the name of the project they were working on. It's actually just a dimer acid is what the PFAS actually is. But it's worth noting that it was included in those finalized maximum contaminant levels. What was happening is Chemours was making, they were manufacturing Gen X using a longer chain compound. And it ended up being a byproduct. So it was discharged into the system. We don't know a lot about the toxicological effects, but I do have to admit that we are seeing some concerning issues where it's very concentrated in our area. Okay. So this was something that landed on the MCLs. I think Chemours was upset over it because when it came to UCMR5 data, it actually, there was nothing. None of the systems had issues with Gen X. And around here, we've done a really good job of cleaning it up. Still waiting from that big paycheck from Chemours though. With that, I just want to talk very briefly because this is not my expertise. Later on, you're going to be so lucky to hear from my coworker, Lindsay, and she's going to talk a lot about some of the more detailed treatments and things like that. But I just want to talk about, okay, so reverse osmosis is a type of way you can treat these things. You're going to get non-detects when you have reverse osmosis. However, you need a lot of money and a huge footprint, okay? Another option is that granular activated carbon, or GAC, as some people call it. Complicated matrices, it can be very tough. GAC is great with those long chain compounds like we talked about, PFOA and PFAS. But the short ones tend to break through very quickly, okay? And then you have ion exchange resin, same type of deal. It attracts the PFAS and then it eventually will be spent. And we have to figure out what to do with that resin or that carbon. What happens to it once it's concentrated and packed full of PFAS? What do we do with it? And there's lots of other really fun destruction technologies. But we're still on the cusp of just figuring everything out, guys. It's just, we're very new in this. And again, we've got a long way to go. We're still struggling with this puzzle, Wild West show. Regulatory update. So as we talked about, regulations are rapidly evolving. At the federal level, we're talking about the EPA here. It committed itself to very different objectives and timelines, okay? Some of those are the Safe Drinking Water Act, which means they can protect the quality of water and set enforceable limits. The Clean Water Act, it authorizes the EPA to regulate and limit PFAS discharges into surface waters through permits and water quality standards. CERCLA, or as you might know it, the Superfund, this designates PFAS as hazardous substances, enabling cleanup of contaminated sites and holding responsible parties liable. And then we have RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And this gives EPA permission to manage PFAS-containing waste from generation to disposal, requiring stricter handling and tracking. Many of these are very recent and impactful to solid and wastewater industry. So as we talked about, the EPA finalized those enforceable MCLs for 6 PFAS in drinking water, PFOA and PFAS being the big key regulators. As you probably have heard, they're looking to rescind the other 4 compounds. That's still in progress right now. But monitoring at those public water systems started in mid-2025, and these standards represent the lowest ever set for water. UCMR5, so like we talked about, this is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule 5th round. It looked at 10,000 public water systems, 29 PFAS compounds. The data was collected from 2023 to 2025. All of that data is publicly available. And what that did was just evaluate PFAS occurrence to help support future rulemaking. Okay. Wastewater utilities are moving into the spotlight. So back in 2024, there was an EPA proposed information collection rule. And this targeted publicly owned treatment works nationwide. It was going to focus on influent, effluent, and sludge. The goal was to understand PFAS movement through the treatment systems and inform future NPDES permits. So POTWs increasingly were positioned as receivers and not sources, which is good, right? However, I'm not really sure where this rule stands at this point. I know with the change of administration, there's been some like deadlines that have been kind of delayed. The last I heard, it was up for public comment. So, but I have a feeling this is still going to be ongoing. You guys are definitely going to be seeing this coming down the pike, and need to be ready to start sampling those parameters. Okay. States continue to move ahead independently. Like I said, patchwork quilt. Lots of states are starting to include PFAS monitoring as part of their NPDES permits. States like Massachusetts, for instance, are taking it a step further, and anyone with a permit, they are requiring them to start monitoring. Okay. So states have kind of started going on their own, whatever issues they're having, they're setting their own drinking water limits. Some are looking at groundwater standards, soil and surface water guidance, kind of like Illinois, which we're going to get into. Let's talk about what your state is doing and how to plan. Illinois' PFAS regulations snapshot. What you need to do now. Sample for PFAS. Your influent and effluent will need to be tested quarterly. Biosolids and sludge semi-annual. And you'll report your results through the net DMR. Okay. If PFAS are detected, you need to conduct source tracking and identify those industrial users and landfill leachate, things like that, and figure out where it's coming from and ask them to maybe change their ways or, create some sort of we need to get some treatment going, start monitoring themselves, that type of thing, get ahead of it so you're not having to deal with it on the back end. And implement a PFAS reduction program. Like I said, work with those contributors to reduce the loading. So we're going to talk about industrial pretreatment impacts. You need to evaluate and monitor those industrial users and make a plan, as we just talked about, and require additional sampling, best management practices, and encourage that chemical substitution, as well as pretreatment upgrades, such as we just talked about, GAC, ion exchange, or reverse osmosis, or any other thing, any other type of technology that might be out there that we just don't know about yet. We need to get on that and start working on that. So like I said, you guys don't have the problems in the back end. What you don't have, and what many states do not have, is a statewide PFAS effluent limits. We're hoping for a practical limit, guys. Setting these at drinking water standards is not practical. Can be done, but is it practical for you all? We want to make sure we're making smart moves when it comes to this. No biosolids PFAS limits. Again, we're still on that biosolids. We're trying to figure out what's really going on. Are they impacting our environment as bad as we think they might be? Talking about that, getting to the bottom of that. And just hoping that monitoring is going to help us build these future regulations. So operator takeaways in Illinois: start early, sample, identify, and engage those industries. Focus on source control and go ahead and just expect those tighter rules in upcoming permits. Okay. Sources and receivers. So it seems like the PFAS life cycle is pretty black and white, right? Well, it's not. And from this little graphic here, you can see you have your industry, your chemical producers, and your AFFF, and it's pouring into the receivers of PFAS waste streams, your landfills, your wastewater treatment plants, and the sludge and biosolids. The problem is, yeah, of course, that makes so much sense that, the sources and you guys are receivers. However, wastewater treatment plants do not remove these contaminants from water, and they don't destroy them. Some PFAS might be removed from the effluent, but some contaminants also might accumulate in those biosolids. Biosolids are the primary sink for PFAS. Most biosolids are land applied. So what are we doing? We are becoming the sources when we're land applying those biosolids. Contaminants re-enter the environment and it spreads to soils. And then they recycle back via, ending up in our drinking water, our source waters, things like that. So what's happened is the wastewater treatment plants have become a transfer point and not a destruction point. So, this makes it very difficult to determine who's a source and who's a receiver. That's why it's important that, it's the blame is not lying on you all, that we're getting it from the actual source and stopping it there. Stop cycling it around in this vicious cycle that we've been doing for so long that we didn't even know we were doing. So there was a PFAS study done in Minnesota back in 2021 because there was so much growing attention on the solid waste industry due to the high levels of PFAS found in landfill leachate. So landfill leachate is the top source of PFAS in Illinois. It's most consistently high PFAS entering from POTWs. PFAS come from consumer products, packaging, textiles, coatings that are disposed of in landfills. Leachate is often hauled or piped directly to the wastewater treatment plants. What the study kind of showed us is that if you're accepting landfill leachate, you might as well go ahead and expect 10 times higher PFAS levels than a wastewater treatment plant that does not. In this study, they looked at 101 there's 110 closed landfills in Minnesota, but they looked at 101 of them for PFAS. And PFAS were detected in 98, but 58 exceeded that drinking water guidance. So as you can see, those red circles, those are 10 times, very concentrated area, 10 times higher than what we are enforced for us to be acceptable, like to be safe, right? That we think safe. And then all those little yellow and orangey dots, those are just exceedances, okay? I just want to go ahead and note that it's very, very expensive to treat landfill leachate. So in my area, we talked to a New Hanover County is where I'm kind of at. Talked to them where they're starting to treat the landfill leachate before it goes to the POTWs, and they're using reverse osmosis. They can process 75 gallons a day. So I mean, 75,000 gallons a day. You know how much the power bill is? $14,000 a month. And they are also constantly replacing filters, which cost them tens of thousands of dollars. Prior to treatment of this landfill leachate, they were measuring at 30,000 part per trillion PFAS. So that just puts it in perspective of how much this is going to cost us. Okay. So biosolids are rich in nutrients and have long been used to improve soil health and support crop growth. Removing this option can create new waste management challenges, like sending everything to landfills. Just like we talked about, sending them to landfills does not seem like the right answer. If they originate from industrial sources, the risk profile changes. A powerful example of this is the Maine farmer crisis. And this is kind of where this all came to light. Okay. Historically, they'd always added biosolids to their farms and their land. And it was, from industrial waste. The result was, long story short, the farmers had to abandon their land and in some cases euthanize livestock due to PFAS bioaccumulation in the cows. These are dairy cows. So, this ended up being in the people of this area too, because they were drinking the milk. So this is the standard that we're looking at, and it's a clear warning that it's very important that we're transparent when we're looking at sources and that we're being very diligent when we're looking into these types of land applications and making sure we're tracking it and testing and not allowing something like that to happen. We did do a little study here in North Carolina where we looked at 37 different types of wastewater treatment plants across NC. The main result was that PFAS was detected in all the matrices. However, a lot of it ended up more in the influent than it did in the biosolids. So it wasn't accumulating as bad as we thought in the biosolids. So that is positive. and something that we need to continue to look at and hopefully, get to the bottom of how we can work this, how we can deal with this waste. Test methods. Here's the pride and joy of PACE Analytical Laboratories, what I love to talk about. So when it comes to PFAS, this slide here is just kind of to drive home a key point, that choosing the right analytical method for PFAS testing depends entirely on the sample matrix. Each of these matrices behaves differently during extraction and analysis. They have unique interferences, detection challenges, and regulatory requirements. Soil and sediment needs aggressive extraction protocols, and AFFF concentrate is a whole different beast because of its very complex formulation. So what I mean to say here is that when you are starting out on your PFAS journey and you're going to your lab, be very transparent about what you're working with. Is this, when it comes to drinking water, is it the raw or is it the finished drinking water? Are we looking at groundwater or surface water? Is there any historical data that you know about? Is there high TOC? Things like that are really important for us as we, learn to analyze these and want to give you the best data, because it's not cheap, right? It's very expensive testing, and we want to make sure that we are giving you the best data possible. So drinking water testing methods were among the first established due to their significant impact on human health. Method 537.1 was the very first method. It looked at 18 compounds and had a 14-day holding time. This used our solid phase extraction, which all of our methods do, but the quantification technique was the internal standard. When they developed EPA 533, it became kind of like the gold standard method because it used isotope dilution, which is really the proper technique to use because PFAS are kind of unpredictable. What isotope dilution does is it kind of helps us see from beginning to end what's happening to the PFAS compounds in your sample. And we do that by spiking in I call it kind of like a identical twin. We spike in a standard that we're not going to find out in nature, that's not going to be found in your sample, but very similar. It's going to act chemically the same way as the PFAS in your sample will. So if we lose any, we can track it and we can apply a calculation to make sure that we're accounting for any losses in the sample. So, and we do that by looking at the mass, because these are measured on a liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. When we look at the mass, we can look at our standard and differentiate it from your PFAS compounds that might be in your sample and determine exactly if we lost anything, whether it be in the extraction part or in our instrumentation. Okay, so this isotope dilution changed the game. It is the much better method. And when they did UCMR5, all 25 compounds were taken from EPA 533. Only 4 were used out of 537.1. And those were the longer chain compounds. And just to be open about it, we really didn't see any of those long chain compounds in any of our water systems that we looked at. Okay, so they're not very prevalent. So I wouldn't be surprised if 537.1 were kind of phased out at some point, because we just have a much better method with EPA 533. And it includes those short chain compounds that we want to look at. And here are the MCLs. The compounds that are included in those enforceable MCLs. EPA announced that they wanted to rescind those ones in red, Gen X, PFBS, PFNA, and PFHXS. And I think they when they looked at the UCMR data, they kind of confirmed that this was a good idea. So they went ahead, and it is something that they are going forward with at this point. We talked about how Gen X is mainly just here in North Carolina, and we've kind of got it under control. But North Carolina, for instance, might want to keep looking at Gen X. So the states have their own way of going about and doing what they want to do. But the EPA is looking to rescind them. And this will actually be good because removing this hazard index, which regulates chemicals individually, normally, this hazard index allowed for different mixtures of compounds to be assessed for their hazards. And it actually was kind of a bit of a a headache for the municipalities. It was not an easy calculation or easy thing to understand. So, yeah, we'll see what happens with that. EPA 1633. So this was a really big deal when this one got finalized. It got finalized in 2024, and the DoD really had a big stake in it for getting this method finalized due to their historical uses of AFFF, like we talked about. Before we had EPA 1633, we had no idea what compounds to look at. You know, it finally put all the labs on the same sheet of music as far as what compounds are important. So they determined 40 PFAS compounds that they found most important out of the 15,000 that are out there. And they put everybody on that to look at those 40 versus before we had this method, even different labs amongst our PACE network had different compounds that each lab looked at, different reporting limits, different things that they, you know, were important in that area. So this was a really big deal, and we're really thankful for this method. And what it did was it's kind of phasing out our old historical methods, such as 537 modified, if you've ever heard of that method. Okay. And here are the 40 compounds that it looks at. These three highlighted in blues, those are precursors. And these are likely to degrade into other terminal PFAS compounds like we've talked about. But I just want to talk quickly, since, you know, Illinois, the biggest contributor to PFAS is the landfill leachate. 5,3 FTCA is one of the big ones. That's going to allow us to say, okay, this originated from a landfill. That's where this is coming from. And if you see 5,3 FTCA in your influent and you're not seeing it in your effluent, we know what happened there. We know that it transformed into a different compound. So, you know, it's really cool that the EPA did include some of these crucial precursors. EPA 1633 has very low detection limits, guys. We're talking single digit part per trillion. And these are looking at wastewater matrices. As you can see from a note here on the side, leachates, we have to up these about 5 times because we don't want to contaminate our instruments, and they're known to be very, very high. So what we do is we cut down the volume, but it does raise our reporting limits. Same with biosolids. But anyhow, we're very proud of these. This is a very exciting time for us as far as like being a chemist, like, that we're able to quantify down at these low levels. Just thinking about part per trillion, you know, say you spread out 1 trillion $1 bills across your I mean, you would need a lot of space, right? Or you just have a big stack of dollar bills, $1 trillion, and you take out 4 of them, $4. Guys, that's what we're thinking about. Like, it's hard to put it in perspective. You take out $4. Okay, so you're saying that somebody that took out $3 is fine, but somebody took out $5 is not fine. Y'all, that's basically zero. That's nothing. So just to kind of put it in perspective, it is hard applying these limits to matrices like wastewater. So what's really cool is that PACE has come out with, well, EPA has finalized a method called 8327. This is not an accredited method yet. We're hoping it'll get there. But what's really cool about this one is when you're going through your treatment studies, this is a lower cost, a faster lab turnaround, and it only needs 5 mils of water or 50 grams of soil. And it's shown to be a really excellent lower cost substitute for EPA 1633. And like I said, if you're having to take a lot of samples from different areas, this is the method for you. It's very, very reliable. And what's cool about it is that there's not a ton of extraction going on. So it's kind of called a direct inject, even though that's not true. We're not directly injecting the water into the instrument. We are doing a little bit of workup, but there's far less hands on the sample. So this has been a really excellent. We hope the EPA will accredit this method and include it. So, you know, lower cost, lower work, things like that. And this is just a slide from the EPA that I just wanted to share because it included when they did the testing on the EPA A327, they looked at all of these very tough matrices. Again, landfill leachate, metal finisher, pulp and paper effluent, like all of that stuff that is really tough. When they come in the lab, we know we're going to have issues with it, and we need to be mindful that we don't contaminate anything. We got very similar results using EPA 1633 and A327. So it's a very good substitute, and that's promising. Top assay. This one is super cool, guys. So what happens is you have your measured PFAS, which is the tip of the iceberg, but underneath you have a whole bunch more of those precursors that we're not measuring, we're not quantifying, we're not even looking at. Well, what we can do in the lab, and this is not an accredited method either, but it's just a cool way, if you're going through your pilot studies, to make sure that we are cleaning up everything. We don't want to just clean up only known PFAS. We want to clean up ones that might be a problem later on. So what we do is we add heat and oxidation in the lab, and we force the transformation from those precursors into their terminal PFAS. And this is the results. As you can see here, H2FTS pre-oxidized had this many PFAS. This is 22,300 part per trillion. Once it was oxidized, it was at non-detect. So this blue bar here, and then there's no orange bar. And that just means it was completely oxidized. But what we did see is that maybe it was 8,2-FTS, maybe it was 6,2, maybe it was some other compound, but all of a sudden, compounds like PFBA, which had only 13,700, shot up to 152,000. So we're forcing that transformation and looking to see what's really happening post heat, post any type of treatment steps that you're using in your system. So, and making sure that, you know, whatever's happening, we're able to see it and treat it. Okay. What's really going on? We want to see zeros on this post-ox. Okay. If you're using a treatment. And then I'm just going to call out absorbable organic fluorine. Basically, guys, this is just a PFAS warning light. We're looking at a liquids only here and seeing if it has any organic fluorine in it. PFAS are organic fluorine. The problem is this does not speciate anything. It's just basically a good screening tool. If you think you have a very hot sample, you think it's full of PFAS, and you just kind of want to get a good screen of what you're thinking is happening, this is a good tool to do that. It does have a 2 part per million reporting limit, which is fairly high, but it's just a warning light. Okay, this is smoked with PFAS. What are we going to do? What are we going to do now? Let's figure this out. Like I said, just used as a screening tool. Field sampling. And Lindsay's going to talk a lot about cross-contamination and stuff like that. But I just want to throw out there that you are a walking PFAS bomb. Anytime you're using shampoo, conditioner, antiperspirant, body wash, any of those things, you are adding to the PFAS on you. So when it comes to field sampling, be mindful of what you're using, and you know, it just be, like I said, just be mindful, be smart about it when you're out there field sampling, because all of these things do have PFAS in them. They're very ubiquitous. And, you know, acceptable materials are HDPE, silicone, you know, stainless steel, and make sure you're kind of deconning things. But these are the materials that are okay. Glass, yes, PFAS can absorb to the glass and stick to it. They like to do that. But we do have very aggressive protocols as far as rinsing really well and making sure we're getting as much as we can out. But just these are things to just think about when you're out there in the field. Your gear, guys, it has PFAS. Sharpie markers are incredible and we love them, right? But they're waterproof, meaning they have PFAS in them. You know, a lot of these waterproof clothings, your nice boots, things like that, they all have PFAS. So just, again, just be smart when it comes to sampling. Use your gloves, keep it as tight as you can, you know, close it as soon as you can. things like that. And again, you're so lucky to learn from Lindsay about this study we did and how field sampling, some good results out of our field sampling study we did. So takeaways. We finally made it, guys. So the US EPA has finalized enforceable drinking water limits for 6 PFAS compounds under the Drinking Water Act. There may be changes ahead. PFOA and PFAS could remain regulated, while others may be reconsidered and regulated on the drinking water, wastewater, groundwater, soil, and solid waste. Industrial discharges can impact PFAS levels in biosolids, especially when land applied. EPA methods 1633 and 1621 are now finalized and widely used for PFAS testing. Field sampling and quality control are more important than ever to avoid contamination. And y'all, Pace Analytical is your go-to source for up-to-date PFAS info and full-service lab testing. Please keep us in mind as you're going through these things. We are your partner. We want to help you. And here's my amazing team. These are all people I work with. You're going to get to meet Lindsay a little later, actually very soon. And we're all here. We all have our own specialties. Lindsay's great with PFAS treatment. She's, she does that type of stuff. Paul's really good with our regulatory. Ralph works mainly with tissue and sediment. Nick Nigro does a little bit of everything. He was a former engineer. And Mike McFadden is our DoD guy. And then there's me. So I'm just here to talk to you municipalities, which I love. Thank you so much. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope that you'll use me as a resource. Okay. Thank you so much.
Brittany, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindsay, are you in here? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I am through here. Unless you need anything else from me. Mark, Jason.
Yeah, we're here.
Okay. Oops.
It doesn't seem like your camera's working, Lindsay. There we go. We got you.
Okay. I just didn't know if y'all were in the middle of the presentation.
You joined at the right second, girl. I just finished up.
Okay.
Good luck, Lindsay. I'm out of here, guys.
Do you want me to go ahead and share my screen for one of the presentations, Mark?
Yeah, that's fine. You can go ahead.
Do you have an agenda where I should do the fill blank one first or biosolids, or does it matter?
Doesn't matter to us.
Okay. Just let me know if you guys are going to take a break or when you want me to get started. These should be about 30 minutes or so each.
Lindsay, I think we're good.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everybody. I'm sure Brittany went over a lot of PFAS basics, chemistry, sources, some analytical methods. So this presentation talks about the PFAS cross-contamination that could potentially be caused by sampling in the field. My name is Lindsay Boone, and I am one of the PFAS program managers that works with Brittany and the rest of the folks at PACE. And we put this presentation together because there's been a lot of questions about and concern about sampling for PFAS, worries about cross-contamination, being that PFAS is so ubiquitous and it's used in a ton of consumer products. So with that, I'm going to get started. So Brittany might have shown you guys this map, but this is a map of all of our laboratories within PACE. The blue dots are where we perform the PFAS analysis. And the red circles are our labs that focus on drinking water and that held UCMR accreditation. UCMR is an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. I'll admit Brittany real quick. Here we go. The data that I'm going to talk about mainly came from our Peoria lab and our Ormond Beach lab. And those labs have certification for various states. So the data I'm going to be talking about didn't just come from Illinois or Florida. It came from field samplers and drinking water plants all over the country. So PFAS routinely has been referred to as a puzzle. Brittany might have talked about this. You know, we've had a lack of federal regulation. That's obviously changing now that we have 6 PFAS compounds codified in the Safe Drinking Water Act that cause non-uniformity between state regulations. A lot of states were doing sampling of drinking water and wastewater prior to PFAS being regulated with associated MCLs, maximum contaminant levels. For a while, we had a lack of environmental test methods. We do now have the drinking water EPA methods, as well as an EPA method for non-potable PFAS 1633 that I'm sure Brittany covered. The real issue with the cross-contamination issue and concern was the very low detection limits. And the reporting limit is at 2 part per trillion. Our detection limits are sub PPT. So it was almost, people were worried, you know, if you sneeze while you're sampling, there's potential for cross-contamination. And then a lot of states put out their own SOPs, standard operating procedures, for these ultra restrictive field guidances. I remember back in 2017 through 19, you know, people were so concerned about cross-contamination. You know, they would say you shouldn't have showered in the last week, don't wear deodorant. And so really we wanted to look at, is this a major concern? Are we cross-contaminating when we're pulling these samples in the field? So cross-contamination concerns really came from, again, how ubiquitous PFAS is, and the fact that sampling materials such as clothing, sunscreens, bug repellent footwear, even sampling equipment, for instance, like some pumps have Teflon, and the waterproof notebooks that a lot of consultants use can contain PFAS. And a lot of that is because of the non-stick properties and the water-resistant properties. And then again, these single-digit reporting limits, which the reporting limit is 2 part per trillion, and now we're regulating PFOA and PFOS at a 4 part per trillion threshold. So because of this, the concern is there might be more potential for field sampling to cause cross-contamination. So again, there's a lot of concern and time that's been taken into account by field samplers and states to write these SOPs to limit PFAS exposure in the field. Well, limit the sample's potential PFAS exposure in the field. And that's why the field quality controls, such as field blanks, equipment blanks, were of the utmost importance when sampling for PFAS. So an example of that is we just wrapped up last year in December the UCMR 5, so the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, which was a survey of our nation's drinking water systems for just what it sounds like, unregulated contaminants that we were testing for 29 PFAS plus lithium. And the requirement the EPA put out that every time a drinking water plant pulled a sample for this UCMR 5 data at the entry point of their distribution system, they had to pull a corresponding field reagent blank. And the biggest driver now for the concerns is the potentially that the field sampler could be contributing to a failure for the Safe Drinking Water Act. So in March of 2023, the EPA proposed 6 compounds to be in the Safe Drinking Water Act with associated MCLs. They also threw in what they call the hazard index, which is essentially it's the first time the hazard index has been used for drinking water regulations. A lot of times it gets utilized for CERCLA under hazardous substance rules. But what the hazard index does, it looks at concurrent toxicity when you have one or more of these compounds present. Now, the final rule was set in April of 2024. And that initial final rule, you had 3 years to complete initial monitoring. So that would go to 2027, and then 5 years to implement treatment. However, the update is the new administration is proposing rescinding all of the compounds that are in red, as well as that hazard index, and extending the implementation period for remediation to 2031. That doesn't alleviate the concern for cross-contamination because we're still going to have to proceed for now, as all of these compounds are set in place and being regulated. And it's going to leave PFOA and PFOS that had these enforceable limits at 4 part per trillion. And the part per trillion is like a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And just to tell you guys, the difference between the MCLG, which is the maximum contaminant level goal, and the MCL is the MCLG, you can see it's 0 for PFOA and PFOS. That's because those 2 compounds are likely carcinogens. So they would have to not be present for there to be no adverse health effects to a vulnerable population. Now, the MCLs, maximum contaminant level, they take into account the ability to remediate at that level and to accurately quantify, and the cost that it would the drinking water plants would incur to remediate at those levels at 4 part per trillion. So this is an example of a laboratory's calibration curve for EPA 537.1 for PFOA in particular. So EPA 537.1 is a method that is for finished drinking water, and it's allowed to be utilized for the Safe Drinking Water Act compliance. One of the major concerns that folks had with PFOA and PFOS being regulated at 4 part per trillion is because it's really close to where our reporting limit is. So we have these calibration curves, and you've got the low end of the curve and the high end of the curve. And this is where we feel confident in our data and the result that we give you. And you can see at the lower end of the curve, there might be more I guess, bias. Like, if you got from a laboratory perspective, 4.5 is very similar to 3.5 because there can be 20% variability in these methods, plus or minus. But for you guys, you fail at 4.5 and you pass at, say, 3. So a lot of folks were thinking that maybe the new administration would not just rescind those 6 initial PFAS compounds, but increase the MCL for PFOA and PFOS to 10 part per trillion, but that's not what happened. So let's talk about field sampling restrictions. These are typical restrictions that you'll see in a field sampling guidelines for clothing and hygiene. So no clothing or boots that contain Gore-Tex, and the Gore-Tex is, it's got that water resistant property, which is why PFAS has been great for its industrial uses, but it can cause problems in the field for field sampling. Then you've got safety boots, must be made from polyurethane or PVC. You don't want that waterproofing. For instance, like waterproofing or Scotchgard that was utilized a lot in like the carpet industry and textile industry, that's that waterproofing, stain resistant, has caused a lot of problems because they were utilizing high levels of PFAS containing compounds in the manufacturing process. So like North Georgia, for instance, where there's a bunch of carpet manufacturers, has a major issue with PFAS due to land application of biosolids and the runoff into source water for drinking water plants that, at the time didn't have any remediation to remove PFAS at the entry point of their distribution system. You've also got no materials containing tieback. A lot of folks, when they field sample, would like to use tieback, but again, that waterproofing and that kind of slicky texture that's on tieback can potentially contain PFAS. And then fabric softener on clothing to be worn. PFAS are surfactants, so potentially they could be in some laundry detergent and fabric softeners. And then not using cosmetics, moisturizers, hand cream, or other related products a day of sampling also need to be taken in consideration. We do a lot of consumer product testing, and I have definitely seen some makeups, like saw an eyeshadow one time that had like a 6 part per billion level of PFOS, and we're regulating that in drinking water at 4 part per trillion. If you think of the moisturizers, sunscreens that could be, again, waterproof or have that SPF resistant property. That carbon fluorine bond that's so strong in a PFAS compound is also why they get utilized for these cosmetics as well. Oh, we just talked about sunscreen, the insect repellent. Wet weather gear, again, that's going to be a big one because of that waterproofing property that PFAS gets used in. And then positives, it's always advisable to wash your hands and definitely use powderless nitrile gloves. You want to be able to change your gloves in between each sampling point, and you could also change them in between like your field blank and your actual sample at the tap or wherever you're pulling your sample. If it's wastewater, you might be doing a grab. And you can always also get PFAS-free water from the laboratory to decon your equipment. And then no food or drink at the sampling site, and no use of Sharpies. So the food or drink come in because a lot of people will talk about the inside of hamburger wrappers or pizza boxes. They can have that insulating property and nonstick properties as well. Is it likely that if you have a McDonald's bag in the back of your truck next to your cooler with your PFAS bottles, it's going to jump in there and contaminate? Probably not. But what you don't want to do is introduce any doubt into your sampling process, especially if you have a hit in one of your live samples. And there's no use of Sharpies, so we always just recommend using a standard ballpoint pen, not the gel kind, but just the standard ballpoint pen. So field quality controls. So your main quality controls are your field blank, and in the realm of PFAS for EPA 537.1 as well as EPA 533, the two methods that are able to be utilized for the Safe Drinking Water Act, they call them a FRB, field reagent blank. And the field reagent blank, again, is just meant to validate field sampling activity, and that what you're doing in the field does not contribute to any background PFAS in your sample. And 537.1 and 533 for compliance purposes require running that FRB alongside of your sample, and you would run an FRB at every entry point of your distribution system for compliance. Even if you had 12 wellheads that you were pulling from, you would run an associated FRB at each one of those wells. Now, an equipment blank is really up to the end user of the data. Equipment blanks aren't written into these methods, but for instance, if you're using a hand baler or a dipper or a pump, a lot of folks like to run an equipment blank to make sure that that equipment is clean, right? You're validating the cleanliness of sampling equipment before the samples in between sampling points. And that's where we can provide you with the PFAS-free water that we've tested and certified in the laboratory to be free of PFAS. A lot of folks like to clean their equipment with Alkanox, do some DI rinses, and the last rinse would be with the PFAS-free water. Trip lengths are pretty typical for environmental methods. We don't see them so much utilized for PFAS, and that's just meant to validate that the samples weren't cross-contaminated en route to the laboratory. So again, for drinking water compliance purposes, the FRBs are required. If you're testing wastewater utilizing method 1633, which Brittany probably covered briefly, None of this is written into those methods. So any quality control that you want to run, even including the field blank, is completely up to the sampler and the end user of the data. So how does the FRB work? So what we do is we send you out, so let's just back it up. So for the field samples for EPA 537.1 or 533, we send you out 250 ml bottles that contain a preservative. For 537.1, it's a trisma preservative. For 533, it's an ammonium acetate preservative. A lot of times, by the time the ammonium acetate gets to you in the field, it'll look like the bottle doesn't have anything in it, but as soon as you open it, you're going to be able to smell that ammonium acetate. So for the sample, you fill up 2 empty containers and invert them to disperse that, that preservative, which helps to regulate the pH and chloride content. Now, for the field reagent blank, what we send you out is one 250 ml bottle that has PFAS-free water in it, and then one empty bottle that will be either 537.1 or 533, depending on the method that you choose to utilize, that will contain the corresponding preservative. So you just open the PFAS-free water bottle in the field, the same place that you're pulling your sample, and you transfer that water into that empty preserved bottle. And again, you'll invert that bottle to disperse the preservative, which acts as a buffer for pH and chloride content. So field sampling resources, I mentioned that a lot of states have tons of sampling SOPs, and we just like to put these links into this presentation. If I know Mark's got a copy of this presentation and can distribute this to the group. That way, if you are at a facility that's looking at sampling for PFAS and you want to have some guidances for the operators that are pulling the samples or the lab techs, that you can look at these instructions and you can base your own internal SOP off of what has already been documented as working to eliminate cross-contamination. So if we look at the field blank data, what we did is we wanted to pull samples that had a corresponding FRB. And we wanted to look at drinking water samples because the drinking water samples were the ones that most frequently utilized a field reagent blank because it is written into the method for compliance purposes. Now, we didn't use data from UCMR5 programs because for the UCMR5 program, the reporting limit cut off at 4 part per trillion. But for non-UCMR5, when I showed you that calibration curve, we default to the 2 part per trillion reporting limit. So we wanted to look down as far as we could to see if we had any sort of hit caused by field sampling in this drinking water study. So even though it was a drinking water study, you can use this data and the prevalence of cross-contamination when you're thinking about pulling your wastewater samples as well. It's still relevant. Again, we just used drinking water because there were more samples that had associated field reagent blanks. So we looked at a 6 months period from our PACE drinking water laboratories and pulled over 14,000 data points. We didn't choose just EPA 537.1 or just EPA 533. We did kind of a split between those methods. We had around 9,100 data points from 533 and around 5,000 data points from EPA 537.1. And again, I just wanted to reiterate for UCMR5, we were testing 29 PFAS compounds. So it was expanded beyond that list of 6 that are currently regulated in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And we were reporting any hits in this study for any of these 29 compounds. So 533 has 25 compounds, 537.1 has 18 compounds. There are 4 compounds in 537.1 that do not overlap with 533. and we reported data from the conglomerate of all 29 compounds from both of these methods. And all 29 PFAS that are looked at in this UCMR program are included in the EPA 1633 list, which as written initially was 40 compounds. So all 29 of these compounds are also associated with EPA 1633 as well. So my question to you, and I don't know if you guys can even answer, is what percentage of hits do you think that we saw in the filled reagent blanks greater than the reporting limit of 2 ppt? Do you think it was greater than 50%? Because PFAS is everywhere. Do you think it was less than 1%? We've been making a mountain out of a molehill, or is it on average around 25%? I don't know if anyone can answer, but any thoughts? Maybe Mark, you can guess.
So Brad Powers from Washington, pick C.
Okay, so around C, and that's usually what most people choose. It's the most logical kind of midpoint there. But what we actually saw was there were only 111 detections at or above the reporting limit of 2 part per trillion. So it was actually less than 1%, so 0.79%. So we're doing a really good job of field sampling and following these SOPs, or maybe we were being a little dramatic when it came to the potential of cross-contamination from field sampling with PFAS. And we send out some guidances for field sampling, but we weren't looking over the shoulder at any of these operators. We just pulled this data kind of blind. So we don't, it could have been somebody who was really paying attention to an SOP to somebody who didn't even know the potential for cross-contamination. So very low percent of hits. Now, we took that 0.79% and broke it down even farther. You can see on the screen here, we looked at what percentage of those compounds were their hits for. And the compounds that have the asterisk by them are all the compounds that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So you had less than 1% for PFNA and HFPODA, which is commonly known as Gen X. PFOA and PFOS, about 5 and 8%. And then PFBS, which is encompassed in that hazard index, 7%. PFBA is of interest because it's pretty prevalent. PFBA is a short chain, it's a C4 carboxylic acid, and a lot of the long compounds that Brittany probably covered called precursors like to degrade in these shorter chain PFBA compounds. Now, by far, the biggest prevalence of cross-contamination or contributor for cross-contamination was the 6,2 FTS at 34%. So we wanted to look at, well, where could this 6,2 FTS be coming from and what's it utilized for? So 6,2 FTS is a replacement compound for PFOS. PFOS was that compound that was manufactured by 3M and utilized a lot in AFFF firefighting foam, the aqueous film forming foam. We can't manufacture it in the United States anymore, so industries started making replacement compounds, and that's 6,2 FTS, which is a fluorotella isomer. It's also used in a lot of manufacturing processes as well. 6,2 FTS is a well-known laboratory contaminant, and it often shows up in our own method blanks. So a lot of times the contamination that we see could be potential lab contamination and not from the field sampling itself. And just to back up, 6,2 FTS, it's also used very heavily in chrome plating facilities, and that is a subset of dischargers that are on a list to have some associated levels set in the effluent limitation guidelines, the EAGLE plan, because chrome plating is a very well documented source of PFAS discharge into our nation's waterways. And just to reiterate, 6,2 FTS, it's not a false positive. When we see it show up in our chromatography, the way that we analyze and quantify PFAS, what we do is look at the way these compounds kind of fragment. We're looking at mass to charge ratios, and it's a big compound. So essentially, the bigger the compound, the more fragmentation patterns that we have. You can kind of think of them as a fingerprint that allows us to say, hey, this really is 6,2-FTS. It's not another contaminant that's just showing up at the same place in our chromatography where 6,2-FTS would be eluting, is what they call it. So a lot of times I'm asked to look at laboratory reports when we have a hit or a client has a hit for a contaminant in their field reagent blank. And one thing that I wanted to share is how you can kind of QA your own report. So you can check to see if you have a hit for PFAS in your actual sample or if it's non-detect at the method reporting limit. So that's the first thing you're going to do. You can look at our method blank. So with every batch of 20 samples for 537.1 and 533, the EPA drinking water methods, we're required to run a method blank. So a method blank is essentially an analyte-free matrix, so PFAS-free water that's processed at the same exact manner and time as a sample. So it's used to determine background contamination or interference in the analytical system. The blank container, the sample matrix, absent of the analyte, and all reagents used at the appropriate concentrations. So a method blank is checking to see if any of the methanol I used in my extraction process had PFAS in it. Any of the bottles that are used had PFAS in it. If there was leftover contamination potentially on the needle of the instrument that injects our LC vials to put onto the system. Or even we use these solid phase extraction cartridges that sometimes can have background PFAS on it. So the method blank is essentially saying, did anything that the laboratory is utilizing in their analytical approach cause background contamination in the method blank? And if it's in the method blank, it has the potential to carry over to your filled reagent blank as well as your sample and create a hit that wasn't from your sampling process, that was from a laboratory contaminant. So an absence of a hit of the compound that's detected, let's just say 6,2-FTS, in your FRB helps to validate the FRB, or if there is a hit in the FRB, but it is not detected in the method blank, then you can say that is more than likely a sample contamination that occurred in the field. Now, if you have a hit in the method blank that's at the same level in your FRB, then there's potential that it was from a laboratory source. And we are allowed to accept, when we report data, some hits in the method blank if they are very low. So that's something to be mindful of. The other way to check your own, or QA, QC, your own laboratory report, is looking at what they call the MSMSD. So that's a matrix spike and matrix spike duplicate. The drinking water methods require us to run an MSMSD. EPA 1633, the wastewater methods do not. So what is a matrix spike and a matrix spike duplicate? So they're representative, but they're randomly chosen client samples that have a known concentration of the PFAS of interest. So sometimes you'll have a cooler that instead of 2 sample bottles will have 6. And that's because we want more of your sample, because we might randomly choose it to run an MSMSD. And every batch of 20 samples that we process in the laboratory has to have an MSMSD. So we pull these samples that might have PFAS in them, they're blind for us, and we spike in a known amount of PFAS before we work up the sample. So the purpose of the MSMSD is to document the accuracy and precision of the method for that specific sample. And control charts are maintained that are indicative of typical MSMSD recoveries of the real sample. So for instance, if I spike in, we spike at different levels, low and high. Say we spike in 10 part per trillion of 6,2-FTS, we might say we have to be able to recover that at 70 to 130%. Now, what an additional check for cross-contamination would be to look at those MSMSDs. If there's an absence for a hit of the compound you see in the filled blank, that would lead us to believe that that hit in your fill blank is a legitimate contamination. Now, if there's a hit in it, it's not saying that, you know, it's not a true contamination because that sample could have had a hit for that compound in it. But again, looking for the absence of that hit in the MSMSD can kind of validate that, hey, there might have been an issue in the field when I pulled these samples. So to wrap it up, considerations and conclusions, the field reagent blanks, the FRBs and field blanks do have limitations as a mean of determining cross-contamination during sampling. And that's because, again, PFAS are so ubiquitous. So even within the laboratory controls, like the method blank, sometimes we do see anomalies of hits caused from, you know, potential contamination inside the laboratory. And just because the field blank is written into the test method doesn't mean it's always mandatory. There are some environmental methods like EPA 504.1 that it's written into but not mandatory. However, for the safe drinking water initial compliance and monitoring, you do have to run an associated field reagent blank. The instance of these hits are extremely low. So contamination is quite low. We saw it was less than 1% in those, you know, around 14,000 data points that we collected for both 537 and 537 and 533. PFAS can be a costly analysis. The drinking water methods are in the $200 price range. And so that's when you, if you're doing this for internal purposes, you might want to consider not running the FRBs for every sample. You might just want to use them, say, 5 to 20% of the time. But again, you only have that choice if you're not running this for compliance purposes. If you do have a hit in your FRB, you are going to want to resample, especially for the initial monitoring or when folks are running the UCMR5, just to confirm, you know, that you're not contaminating your sample and that potential hit that's in your sample from field sampling can go away, right? Because you don't want any false positives. There's a lot of cost associated with remediating, especially if it's one of those regulated compounds like PFAS. So the cost to resample is nothing compared to the potential cost of a false failure and the fact that you would have to upgrade your plant and remediate to remove PFAS. So I would always lean and be cautious to resample, especially if you're doing this for compliance purposes. And that is the field blank contamination study. And we're right at 11:30 on this one. And the presentation I have next is talking about biosolids. So if you guys have any questions on this study, please let me know. And I can answer those before we move on. And if you guys are going to take a break. Are there any questions in the chat that I'm not seeing, Mark?
Lindsay, I think we're good. Nobody had any questions. We would like to take a 5-minute break. If you're good with that,
Sure.
thank you very much.
Good job, Lindsay.
See if I can bring up the, oh, I don't think I'm sharing my screen anymore. Can you see the biosolids one, Brittany?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
How long did you go? About an hour?
Yeah, yeah. And I started rushing at the end and getting all tongue-tied, but it's okay. So you did perfect, right at 30 minutes.
Yeah.
All right. And then after this, it's Friday. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Oh, we're being recorded, by the way.
Okay. My hotel room just got reassigned to another hotel because President Donald Trump is putting National Guards in the hotel that I'm supposed to stay in.
Oh, at the DC conference? Uh-oh.
Yes. So now it says I have to call Hotel Nell or Capitol Hill Hotel, and I have no idea how far that is from the conference center.
Oh no.
I know. And I was already worried because I've never been.
Oh, of course.
It says he's issued a memorandum restoring law and order in the District of Columbia and is mobilizing the National Guard. That's crazy that it's like last minute. And I'm going to be there Sunday. So that's going to be fun to figure out.
So you can't stay at that hotel at all?
Yeah, I guess the rooms are all booked. Like they're just using it for the National Guard.
Wow, that's
I don't know
scary
how
a little bit.
figure out how far away these two hotels are. So it doesn't even tell like which hotel they're putting me in. And Scotty, that was staying in the hotel with me that I'm presenting with at ACE, is out of office, and she's literally flying from like her friend's wedding in Mexico to DC, and so now she's not even gonna know what to do.
Huh. Well, I'm trying to figure out what's going on in DC that the National Guard would need to be there.
The birthday, the 250th, I don't know, maybe, I don't know.
Lindsay, we're ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. So this presentation, it's a little more technical. It's about biosolid analysis for PFAS, and we cover the challenges with accurately quantify, considerations, and options. And the first part is just a little background on where we're at with biosolids. So what are biosolids and why is there such a stink about them? So how are biosolids regulated and defined? So biosolids are regulated under US EPA 503, 40 CFR Part 503. So it establishes standards for use and disposal of sewage sludge to protect public health and the environment. The definition of biosolids is that it could be a solid, a semi-solid, a liquid residue, and they're all generated during treatment of domestic sewage. The term biosolid is commonly used interchangeably with sewage sludge, but specifically refers to sewage sludge that meets EPA regulations for use and disposal. So EPA 1633, the method that we utilize for wastewater and biosolids really was meant for a dry biosolid. And this study came about because a lot of the biosolids that we are getting in have very low percent solids, like under 5%. So that could cause confusion. And that's why knowing the definition of biosolid was important for us in the laboratory standpoint, is that they are semi-solids and liquid residue. So it's very important to, when you're sending in your biosolid for analysis in the laboratory, to make sure you're accurately filling out your chain of custody and you call it a biosolid. So we know exactly how to treat it based on the EPA methodology that's available for labs to quantify PFAS and biosolids. The different types of biosolids we covered, 3 forms: solids, semi-solids, liquid residue, in different classes, A and B. A contains no pathogens and can be used everywhere. B contains some pathogens and is not utilized in public areas. Why would biosolids contain PFAS? Wastewater contains PFAS, so it's some of the same reasons that wastewater contains PFAS. Industrial discharges, right? We talked about the chrome plating, textile manufacturers. A lot of industrial processes utilize PFAS in their manufacturing and their synthetic routes to make other chemicals. Landfill leachate is a very significant source of PFAS for wastewater treatment plants. And I'm pretty sure Brittany covered that in her source presentation. We've seen that PO2Ws that accept landfill leachate have a lot, up to 10 times higher levels of PFAS than those that don't accept landfill leachate. Domestic wastewater contains PFAS. So even if you're a wastewater treatment plant that only has domestic sources, you can still have PFAS from things like even laundering textiles. We talked about how it was used ubiquitously in stain resistant and waterproof clothing, and it's used in a lot of consumer products. So you're still going to have domestic wastewater that has PFAS. And then one big thing is that in a wastewater treatment plant, you can have a transformation or degradation of those big PFAS precursors that Brittany probably covered, that we're not even quantifying in some of our methods, that can degrade into terminal PFAS that we do quantify. So sometimes what we'll see in a wastewater plant is that your influent actually has a lower total PFAS load than your effluent. And that's because during your treatment process, say if you're adding heat or an oxidative chemical like a sodium hydroxide, you can cause that transformation to occur. One of the main compounds that we see in biosolids is that this 5,3-FTCA. 5,3-FTCA is released during anaerobic digestion in a landfill of carpet. So it's in a lot of C&D landfills, but it also is a root cause for other compounds to be showing up in your biosolids or even in your wastewater. So that compound is not very stable because it's still got carbon-hydrogen bonds that are not as stable as a carbon-fluorine bond. So that carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. Once it's formed, it's really hard to break. That's why people call these forever chemicals. But in these precursor compounds, we haven't fully fluorinated the backbone of these molecules. So they're not as stable. So you add some caustic or heat and they can break down again over time naturally in the environment or in a treatment process into these shorter chain associated carboxylic acids. So this is an example of, I think it was leachate, where we looked at all these compounds to see how prevalent they were. So the compounds with stars are the compounds that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then you can see 5,3-FTCA is by far the highest hit in this sample. And then all of the compounds in green are what 5,3-FTCA can degrade into. So if you're thinking about source identification or trying to figure out where the PFAS in your sample came from, you can't just think about what's showing up in your laboratory report. You have to think beyond that and the potential that it could have started out like a compound 5,3-FTCA, and by the time it hit you was these shorter chain carboxylic acids. 5,3-FTCA doesn't have any regulations associated with it, but these three other compounds it degrades into do have some regional screening levels associated with them. So what are our current approaches to deal with biosolids? By far, land application is the most popular. Historically, it was utilized on wastewaters since the Greek and Roman times. Currently, over 50% of our nation's sludges are land applied as a biosolid. So why is land, and really the monitoring and the potential for regulating biosolids is mainly driven due to us utilizing the land application approach of how to get rid of our biosolids. So obviously there's mounting evidence of widespread contamination caused by land applying biosolids. You just heard me talk about North Georgia with the carpet manufacturers. There are issues there due to land applications of biosolids. Also, PFAS are of more interest in land application of biosolids because of their ability to bioaccumulate. So that means that if they're in the soil, they can bioaccumulate up the food chain into the plant biota or even the animals that feed off of that area. And so there's a lot of litigation and regulatory actions that are underway in states. So here are a few case studies and regulations from different states of what's going on. Now, the first state to come out and strongly enforce limitations on biosolids was Maine. So in 2016, the state of Maine discovered a link between biosolids and PFAS in contaminated milk. We actually have a lab on our Mansfield, Massachusetts laboratory that does a lot of this dairy product testing. So, we were really at the forefront of looking at PFAS and some food products. Specifically in the state of Maine and some of these dairies, they were seeing PFAS, which is a likely carcinogen, to be detected, from 12,000 to 32,000 part per trillion in milk, right? And so keep in mind that compound is now regulated in drinking water at a 4 part per trillion threshold. So we're way above the potential that would be acceptable for human consumption. So what that led to is in 2019, the Maine regulators performed a large-scale study and found widespread PFAS contamination. So they were looking for the source of the PFOS and other PFAS contaminants in those milk products. The contamination was detected in private wells of farms and in soil samples. In 2022, this led to land applications of biosolids being banned statewide. I have a buddy that lives in Maine, and he said, there were trucks literally circling and trying to figure out where they were going to take their biosolids, looking for landfills that would accept them, and how to deal now with the cost associated with not being able to land apply these biosolids. So the ban also spanned other measures, including retroactively clarifying the right to sue for PFAS contamination. So, you could sue a source that was the source, 10, 20 years ago for the contamination that was on your field. A change in the hazardous waste law to hold manufacturers and other responsible parties liable for cleanup and remediation of contaminated soil and water was also initiated. And then you have numerous other states, such as Wisconsin, that we're going to talk about, that are considering measures to regulate PFAS and contaminated biosolids. So really, Maine was kind of the first state that came out and completely banned statewide land application. So what's Wisconsin doing? So Wisconsin's strategy was to have they just have an interim strategy to reduce PFAS concentrations in biosolids and industrial sludges. So the first was PFAS source identification and reduction strategies. So they did a statewide monitoring program to try to put a nail on the sources of the PFAS and biosolids and then implement reduction strategies. So this included regular sampling to monitor PFAS levels and comprehensive testing and sampling from facilities with suspected elevated concentrations. So they could look at a pre-treatment program and see who was on that list, what industries were there. And we know that certain industries like chrome plating or even landfill leachate are major sources of PFAS contamination. So the state now requires permittees sampling of municipal biosolids and industrial sludges based on permits. So based on their Wisconsin discharge permits application, they have to sample and submit their results when they are applying for these permits. And they're the first state to really set a limit. So they allow for land application if you test for PFOA and PFOS between 20 and 150 ppt. If you're above the 150 ppt, the strategy calls for an alternative treatment. So you cannot land apply. And we know those alternative treatments are extremely costly compared to land application. So the University of Michigan did a study on what are our other options or, besides land application. So in the United States, POTWs generate 13.8 million tons of dry weight of sludge annually, and it's got to go somewhere. So our options are landfilling, incineration, and land applications. There are very substantial cost and limited capacity to utilize landfills, right? So that's going to be a very expensive approach. And when it comes to incineration, there's a lot of research on waste incinerators saying that they don't achieve a high enough temperature to completely destroy PFAS. Brittany and I are probably contacted weekly with somebody who's looking at testing biochar, degasification, pyrolysis, and wanting to see if their incineration process is completely destroying PFAS. And the thing is there's more than just testing and utilizing the common methodologies like EPA 1633 to make sure you're destroying PFAS, because you might just be breaking these PFAS down into those shorter chain components. So we at PACE have even come up with an ultra short chain method that a lot of these folks in the destruction technology space utilize to show that they aren't just stopping at C1, C2, C3, they're completely achieving turning that organic fluorine, the carbon fluorine bond, into inorganic fluoride. And when it comes to cost, both incineration and landfilling are high. It's a high cost for a wastewater treatment plant that's going to be passed on to consumers. And land application is clearly, the least expensive option of those three. Now, that's a couple examples from a state level. From a federal action standpoint, we had the EPA in January of 2025 did release a draft risk assessment on biosolids, and that risk assessment was set at 1 part per billion for PFOA and PFOS. You might think that that's high because we're regulating PFOA and PFOS in drinking water at a part per trillion, but to put it in perspective, we are reporting at around 1 ppb for our reporting limit for a solid sample, a biosolid sample. So we're at that risk assessment is about at the level that we can accurately quantify. So the EPA finds PFOA and PFOS contamination of biosolids warranted setting limits on discharges from several industries. And I think Brittany probably talked about the effluent limitation guidelines, and we talked about that earlier, where they would set limits on electro and chrome platers and as well as landfills. However, there is a lot of talk that these limits should not be put on pass-through receivers of PFAS. So a pass-through receiver would be like a wastewater treatment plant or a municipal landfill. And those public comments are ongoing. Here's just some examples of the comments. They extended the comment period, and they've had over 25,000 comments. The comments are very wide ranging. You have negative ones, positive ones, for land application, against land application. Here are a couple that I thought were interesting. An exceptional quality biosolids at parks, playgrounds, and school is a significant concern. The comment was from a large producer of commercial biosolids. So you've got people who send us in a lot of astroturf and things now that they're starting to want to use in playgrounds and parks rather than say like regular grass. You've had the agency should improve the final risk assessment by emphasizing the EPA's role in source reduction and pretreatment, and by revising its incineration and land application section. So that's essentially saying, put it back on the source of the PFAS and not those that are pass-through receivers that are creating the biosolids like the POTWs. This map just shows where we're at for bills that have been adopted, introduced and adopted in different states. It's constantly changing. It's on a Safer States website. This doesn't have it doesn't contain states that have interim strategies like I talked about in Wisconsin, or for instance in North Carolina, they're doing a round of biosolids sampling as well at wastewater facilities, both industrial and domestic and industrial. Now in Illinois, what is the current status of PFAS and biosolids? So the sources are what we've been talking about. Current situation in Illinois: industrial dischargers, consumer products, firefighting foam, ongoing inputs into wastewater and biosolid streams. Regulatory status: there is no numeric PFAS limit in biosolids. We're uncertain what's going to happen. We could just wait for the EPA to set some limits. Monitoring: there has been some sampling of wastewater and biosolids to improved data and support of risk-based decisions. Environmental concerns are just what we've all talked about: soil buildup, bioaccumulation in crop, groundwater contamination from runoff, and the potential impacts of food safety and the drinking water supply. Utility responses, source control, pretreatment, alternatives from disposal, increased operational complexity, and potential costs. So that's not happening yet, but that's something that, is not just specific to the state, but could happen with any POTW that's having to find a way to deal with PFAS in their biosolids. So if we look at the way we quantify biosolids, let's look at it's through EPA 1633, and what are the protocols and analytical challenges. So we report a biosolid or any solid sample as a dry weight. A soil or a sediment sample, we use 5 grams, and we have to run a % moisture analysis. In a biosolid, we only use a 0.5 gram. And that's fine and dandy for something that isn't less than 5% solids. But once you get to a high liquid matrix biosolid, being able to weigh out an appropriate quantity that the method can accurately extract is very difficult. And that's what spawned this study. Weren't the dry cakes, it was those high liquid biosolids. So for instance, if we have a biosolid that contains 5% solid, we have to weight correct that. So essentially you take 5 grams and you divide it by the percent solids. And now the lab knows I've got to weigh out 10 grams as received. So I have to homogenize a sample and weigh out 10 grams. And you add a lot. We add our extraction standards. We add 10 mils of methanol. We vortex, we shake it. We transfer the supernatant into a 50 mil centrifuge tube. At that point, we're at about 20 mils of aqueous because we've taken into account all that moisture that came from the biosolid itself. So the sample is getting bigger and bigger as this process goes on in the sample prep lab. And this is really an issue with how big these samples can get. So we follow this by 2 more extractions, 15 mils of methanol, another 5 mils of methanol. So we're at 20 mils. And plus that's at 19.5 mils of supernatant. We bring it to a 75 mil water, and then we extract it again. So it's a very tedious process in the laboratory. And this is an example of the cake, which is pretty simple for us, that has a higher percent solids, but the liquid biosolid, again, is challenging. They're both challenging matrices because of the variations in percent moisture content and the high organic background. So you've got a lot of organics in there that can affect the QC that we utilize to accurately quantify your samples. So a lot of times when you get a laboratory report back for biosolids, you don't have perfect QC. You have a lot of what they call data qualifiers. And the data qualifiers don't always mean it's a bad thing. It's just something to inform you. And we could rerun a sample, 5 times and still have the same issues because of the complex nature of these biosolid samples. So this is one of the things that spearheaded our study was Minnesota's biosolid strategy. One of our main PFAS laboratories is in Minneapolis, and they reiterated that all samples should be reported on a dry weight basis. So for a while, when biosolid samples would come into the lab and they were high liquids, we at times would say, well, this is more of a liquid than a solid, and we would report it as a liquid sample. And that is not acceptable for a state like Minnesota. And we're not doing that moving forward. So for instance, they have a threshold here that says for samples containing less than 5% total solids, you might lead to increased reporting limits because they're setting a threshold of we have to hit a reporting limit of 20 part per billion. And again, these reporting limits, they just won't work. Like it's very hard to hit 20 ppb utilizing the method as written. And we can't run it as a liquid sample because we have to be able to report in a nanogram per gram as a solid, not a nanogram per liter. So how are reporting limits impacted by biosolids? So here are the nominal reporting limits for a 100% solid sample. No moisture. So if you have soil, the reporting limits are sub 1 part per billion. We use 5 grams. If you have a biosolid, as the method is written, we use 0.5 gram. So it increases 10-fold based on the amount of weight that we're weighing out. However, the reporting limit has to be further manipulated in if you have a low percent solid sample because you're correcting it for that percent solid. So for example, if you have, and we'll just take PFOA, if you have a 5% solid sample where the lab's weighing out 10 grams, you're weighing out 10 grams of sample. If there was 100% solid, your reporting limit would be 2 ppb, but that's not the case. When we correct for that 5% solids in the math, we get 40 ppb, and that exceeds the limit allowed from a state like Minnesota that's setting the limit at 20 ppb. So we as a laboratory have to figure out a way around that. How can we meet the need of the state regulating body and still adhere to the method? So we worked with EPA Region 6 lab to come up with a liquid biosolid study. So we always start off with a problem statement, and it's documented that liquid biosolids with a very low solid content can be challenging to analyze via EPA 1633. In particular, anything that contains less than 5% solids really starts giving the method issues and allowing us to extract the weight we need efficiently, as well as hit the reporting limits that certain state regulating bodies are wanting. So we wanted to determine the limits of 1633A when testing liquid biosolids, compare it to an ASTM method that can be utilized for biosolids, and we wanted to utilize different sources and do an inter-lab comparison study. So the study encompassed our Minneapolis lab and the EPA lab. So the one example I'm going to show is we utilized a biosolid sample that had 1.4% solids. So if I corrected and was weighing it out per the method, I would have to weigh out 35 grams of the solid, and there's no way that the method would work. Really, we can't go above 5 grams. The sweet spot to get a good extraction of the PFAS from a solid sample is 2 to 5 grams. Now, the kicker is that ASTM method that I mentioned doesn't have you correct the weight for percent solids. You just weigh out 2 grams as is. So we were going to utilize 1633 and do a side-by-side comparison with 8535, just weighing out 2 grams, because the 35 gram weight of a 1.4% biosolid is not achievable by the method. So here are the results from PACE comparing these two methods. This is only showing the compounds that were higher hits because these were live samples. And as you can see, PFHXA between both methods was very close. PFOS and PFOA also was close. The J flags indicate that this was between the method detection limit and the reporting limit. FTCA, the 5.3 FTCA that we talked about before, by far was the highest component. It was 135.7 part per billion in ASTM D8535, but in 1633, it would have hit as non-detect because the detection limit was increased. And this is just looking at the QC of the sample, and the ASTM method got really good recoveries, and we were still doing pretty good with 1633 when we were weighing out 3.5 grams, which was in between that 2 and 5 gram threshold. Then we wanted to look at, this was the EPA lab did this, where they spiked the biosolid at different levels. They had like a low spike, a medium spike, and a high spike, and they spiked in these 4 compounds and looked at how good they recover. So that's similar to that's essentially an MSD, a matrix spike is what they did. And they wanted to utilize the ASTM 8535 method. And the low spike was really good for these 3 compounds. Now, it didn't show up in the 5.3 FTCA, and that's because there was just too much 5.3 FTCA in the sample itself. They call it the native sample, to see such a small spike of 3.6 ppb. At the medium, great recovery, and at the high, great recovery as well. Another takeaway that we did is this method says that we have to analyze a sample as received, but we wanted to see, were the PFAS potentially partitioning in the liquid or solid sections of the biosolid? So we tested the sample as received, we centrifuged the sample, decanted off the liquid, and we were left with this kind of black goo. And we analyzed the 4th black goo sample, and it was very similar to the as received sample. So what it's showing is that most of that PFAS mass is in the solid, not in that aqueous portion. However, the method requires us to run it as received, and we're not allowed to do the centrifugation. This was kind of just an internal experiment that we wanted to see where these PFAS were partitioning in the high liquid, high percent moisture biosolid sample. So overall, the conclusion is to make sure you discuss with the lab your matrix. Like I said, make sure you have biosolid on the chain of custody. If you have a biosolid sample that has a high moisture content, it's good to communicate that with your project manager and the laboratory. Over communication is key when it comes to any PFAS methodology and making sure your data quality objectives are met. Also, if you're in a state or involved in any program that has reporting limits that need to be met, you must communicate that with the laboratory so we can employ processes to make sure that we're meeting, again, your data quality objectives. Now, the data that came back from the ASTM method is very powerful. There's actually a multi-lab validation study going on right now with 8535 looking at it for biosolid purposes. So that's very positive. And its sister method, ASTM D8421, that covers liquid matrices, is being codified into the Clean Water Act alongside EPA 1633. And it's of the utmost importance to make sure that you're working with a laboratory that has experience. You know, a lot of, even us at PACE at the beginning, we at times are reporting these biosolids that have high moisture content as liquids. That's not going to be appropriate now that we see regulations and interim guidances moving forward that are going to require us to report these as a solid sample, not as a liquid sample, because if you report it as a liquid, you can't really compare those limits to the solid. And that is what I have on the biosolid study. So I know that one's a little more technical, but if you have any questions, I can respond to those now.
Lindsay, we do not have any questions. We greatly appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So we will go ahead and conclude this meeting, and thank you, Lindsay. Please tell Brittany thank you. We
Alrighty.
really do appreciate you.
Thank you, guys.